And how many tours of duty did you stay in the Navy with VC?
Well, that was a cutback years in '49 and '50, and so the Navy didn't need us. And so instead of keeping 60% of us, they only kept like 8%. So all of us but two of our buddies, Waldo Bourne and Jim White, they were retained USN. The rest of us were told to be ready for discharge. So we got discharged, and as a matter of fact, on the 25th of June, 1950, when I was to be discharged, I was get the mustering out pay window when all of a sudden the Admiral Felix B. Stump, who was Comnav Air Land, commander of the Atlantic Fleet, his aide came down and said, hey, all ex-midshipmen being discharged, the Admiral wants you to come up to his office right now. Well, we did, you know, he's the boss. So we went up there and he says, there's a war just started in Korea. He says, I don't want you to be discharged. We need you. And if you'll stay, if you want to get out, okay. If you don't want to get out, stay in and I'll keep you in. You can go anywhere you want. And we said, well, all of us from VC-33 said, hey, we'll go back to VC-33 because they had switched over from TBNs to Douglas Able Dogs, the AD, up at Atlantic City. So I ended up going back to VC-33 and ended up actually going back there another time. So I ended up over 5 years in the same squadron, going from midshipman to lieutenant all in one squadron.
That's a good story. You didn't actually spend time in Korea most of the time?
No, I didn't. I volunteered to go to Korea as soon as we got checked out. They checked us out in the AD immediately, quickly. We had day-night landings and night landings. And, but they didn't send the young midshipmen. We were all in our early 20s. We wanted to go, but they sent only Jim White was the only one that went out of the 12 of us. That only 10 of us went back to VC-33. But no, none of us. I didn't get to go to Korea, and I wanted to go. I ended up making 3 med cruises and 1 North Atlantic cruise up off the fjords in Norway, and a couple of Gitmo cruises down to Guantanamo Bay. So I spent most of my time in the Mediterranean.
And after you, I guess you discharged yourself out of the Navy.
Yes, I got out of the Navy in September of 1955. I had 10 years in the Navy, and I was a reserve lieutenant, and I didn't want to stay in unless I could make regular, and I didn't make a regular. So I got out in September of 1955 and ended up in Boston. And my wife lived in a place called Winchester, Massachusetts, and I figured, well, I can get a job with the airlines as a co-pilot, although I didn't have an instrument rating at the time. And so but nothing was open. So I ended up going to get a job as a machinist. I thought I could become a machinist. I was a machinist. I had learned how to run a lathe and a grinder in World War II. They didn't have too many laws in World War II. You could work. And so I went over to Raytheon to see about getting a job and ended up with a very, very unusual occurrence in my first attempt for a job as a civilian. I was 27 years old, and I went in to be hired, and I went into this, filled out an application and went into this gentleman's office, and while he shook hands with me and had said, have a seat. And I sat down, and his phone rang, and he answered the phone, and he was talking, and he said, well, as a matter of fact, he says, he's looking at my sheet, and he says, I've got a pilot right here, right now. And he says, I'll send him over. Well, to make a long story short, I was hired 2 months later. I didn't even know Raytheon had an airplane, and I ended up becoming an electronic engineering test pilot for Raytheon, and stayed with them 10 years and became their chief jet test pilot. Well, I flew a Bonanza to start out with. I got checked out in that, and then they knew I had learned to fly a jet in the Navy in 1953, and they had two F-3D Douglas night fighter jets that they used as test beds. Well, I had flown the F-3D at VC-33 in Atlantic City, so that didn't hurt any, and I flew that. And also they had an F-6F Hellcat they used as target. Raytheon was responsible for a new type of missile called FMCW, a Doppler homing type missile that homed on speed more than a bounce back on a signal. And so Raytheon did all the original test work there at Hanscom Field in Bedford, and that's where I did my flying. And the F-6 that I flew, the Hellcat, one day I can tell this story. One day I had taken off and was going up to be a target, and I was up about 10,000 feet, and all of a sudden the cowling ripped off, and was bad was the engine temperature went down from normal operating range down to about 100, 110, 120 degrees centigrade, and the engine was starting to cut out. So I added power to keep it running and came back to Bedford, and the only way I could make to land was to look out the left side. And what I did is I made like a carrier approach all the way around and then chopped it and landed safely and brought it in. And unfortunately, the mechanic who was the plane captain on that plane, he was fired immediately. He hadn't secured the Zeus fasteners on the cowling, and that's what happened.
Was there any other exciting things that happened to you while you were at Raytheon?
Oh yeah, quite a few, but one thing in particular, the F-3H Demon, which was made by McDonnell Aircraft before they merged with Douglas. Well, it was called the Demon, and it had an Allison engine in it, and we were doing the preliminary and run it at just under the speed of sound, which was about with what they call max Q, so that it would give the maximum stress on the missile to see how it would stand up. Well, I was coming back off of Cape Ann. I'd been up a couple hours, and this was the end of the flight, the test flight. And as I was doing this 500 knots, I was about over Beverly or Salem, about 25, 30 miles from Boston, coming in off of Cape Ann, when all of a sudden the engine quit. I had a flame out, and I couldn't relight it. I kept trying to relight it, and it wouldn't. I could just keep it, the fire going, but it didn't have enough thrust for me to. So I was talking to him on the radio, and I said, I got a problem. And it was late afternoon, and there was no wind, and I could see Boston Harbor was glassy calm. And I said, well, I didn't want to bail out because I thought for sure, you know, I had the fear that if I did, it would go in somebody's house or something. It's just one of those things. So I told him back in Bedford that I had a problem and that I was going to switch to emergency. And so about that time, I was picking a spot of course, I'm going pretty fast, and I put down what they call a ram air turbine, which gave me enough hydraulic pressure to operate the controls and stick the gear down if I had to. Well, about the time I was getting ready to put it in the water, I see up ahead Logan Airport, Boston Logan, with two 10,000-foot runways. And I said, oh, and now I've bled down to maybe 300 knots, and I'm down maybe 2,000 feet. And I went to Logan Tower on UHF, and I said, this is Navy 586, I got a flame out, I got an emergency, but I think I can make 22 right. And I said, but I see an airliner at the end of the opposite end, 4 left, getting ready to take off. You get him off the runway, I think I can make it. And they said, Roger, Roger, you're cleared. So he turned around, he turned, got off, and I stuck it on there at about 250 knots on the end of the runway and got it stopped. And I was proud because I didn't even blow a tire. And my boss was happy the plane was safe, really, because we had that experimental Sparrow missile on it. And that, you know what happened? About 2 days after that, we get an engineering notice from the Navy saying, do not fly in or around clouds because the Allison engine will flame out. It did. For the Sparrow, put Sparrow missiles on it. It had no guns, and it had the front seat, and the back seat was for the radar intercept officer. And so I ended up flying that plane for Raytheon, and was the I think I was the 36th pilot to fly it, and I flew that in November of 1959, and it was it was a wonderful airplane, heavy, big, but it did quite a job, and I flew it for about 4 years doing the test work. First one was the 5th plane, and then the 10th, and then the 20th. And I flew it at, also used to come out to Point Mugu and fly it for the Raytheon folks there, but mostly the Navy pilots did the missile firing. I didn't get to fire any missiles. I just did the work for the radar with the aim dot jitter and the control system for the Raytheon Sparrow and the radar. And the reason I got to do that was because, obviously, all the background and doing all the work in the Navy, which we operated radars, and I didn't mention that before, but that was one of the reasons that I got picked to do the work. Maybe we had 8 pilots, and we only 2 of us did the engineering flight test work.